Now, I often reflect on what is America's biggest problem today. And I think I've come up with an answer. It's actually not illegal immigration, although that is a problem. If you can't control your country's borders and determine who comes in and out and who can vote in your elections, ultimately, you're not going to have a very solid foundation for a country. Our biggest problem is also not attacks on our culture from the radical left, attacks including whether there only are two genders, whether America is an evil country founded on slavery and racism. Those types of attacks really attack at the foundation of this country and ultimately affect society in a very direct way. But I would also argue that's not the greatest problem and the most imminent threat that we face today. And of course, it's also not COVID-19. That's silly. The biggest attack that America faces today is actually the left's attack on Americans' free speech. A few weeks ago, President Trump picked once again, I would argue, the perfect battle, just as he did in 2016 and 2015 when he first announced his candidacy for president. He picked the illegal immigration issue back then because he knew that this was an issue that Americans could really get behind. And I would say that he rode that wave very much into the presidency. A few weeks ago, I think President Trump picked once again the perfect battle, launching a lawsuit against Facebook, Twitter, and Google for their censorship of conservatives, including, of course, him a few months ago. He was taken off of Twitter in January after the so-called insurrection that took place, and he hasn't been back ever since. So I think he's done so because he plans on running for re-election in 2024. And I think that he realizes that this is an issue that can really galvanize support among conservatives. And I think it's going to be popular even among independents and perhaps some intellectually honest people on the left, although there are very few today. No other country has free speech to the extent that America does. In our Bill of Rights, freedom of speech is actually guaranteed to all Americans in the very First Amendment to the Constitution. This is all something that we read in history or civics class in school, but we maybe haven't thought about very much because we haven't had to. But it's important to note that without robust free speech, we're not really a free country. And I would argue that we're quickly trending in that direction. And perhaps America today is no longer quite as free as it was even 5 or 10 years ago. After all, how can you say that America is truly a free country when Donald Trump, who is the leader of the Republican Party and the leader of the conservative movement, the former president of the United States of America, how can you argue that we're a free country if he's banned from social media? After all, social media is how society communicates today. Just like if a major political leader was banned from the newspapers 100 years ago, that's very much the same thing as someone being banned from social media today. And it's been 6 months since the so-called insurrection, and Donald Trump is still banned. I mean, he has a presence off of social media to some extent, but his voice is not as widely accessible as it should be, or as it was for many years. Now, the left's robotic and somewhat childlike response to this point would be that these are private companies, Twitter, Google, and Facebook, and if conservatives don't like how they're being treated, they can simply build their own. But it's important to note that when Parler, which was the right-wing alternative to Twitter, when they attempted to not only build their own but expand their own brand in January, their servers were shut off by Amazon Web Services, and they weren't actually even allowed to operate, and they're no longer functioning today. And this is actually quite scary because this was a perfect example of taking the left suggestion of building your own, and in fact building your own, and they weren't permitted to do so. I think that these were the perfect circumstances under which our monopoly laws were crafted to prevent this sort of thing from happening. I think that if monopoly laws can prevent Microsoft, 25 years ago from forcing its crappy Microsoft Word and Excel software down our throats, it can certainly be prevented. Can prevent, I should say, Twitter and Facebook and Google and other big tech companies from holding a monopoly over our country. So all eyes are on Donald Trump and his attorneys on this case, and I really do wish him the best. So I guess I'll transition to my main point of my episode today. I experienced a micro violation of my own free speech rights yesterday evening on Twitter. So I am a follower of Joy Reid, who you may know as the race lady at MSNBC, as Tucker Carlson refers to her, and you may also know her as Homer Simpson, as my wife, who pointed out to me that she has a very close resemblance to the popular cartoon character from The Simpsons. But she's just Joy Reid. She has her own show on MSNBC, and she makes her living making every issue about racial division and attacking the country. I've been trolling her quite actively for a few weeks now, and to some great enjoyment, she actually did, respond to me yesterday. So first, I'll start with some context. Her original post, and I quote, "It's the slavery math. One slave-holding founding father has, say, 500 slaves, even if his goodly slaver wife is a prolific childbearer. Black Jeffersons, Monroes, Washingtons, and Jacksons, literally branded with the household name, will outnumber white name bearers 500 to 4, 500 to 10, etc." Her point being that many Black Americans today have last names of the founding fathers, and the implication, of course, is quite obvious that the founding fathers of America are racist slave owners, and America is a evil, immoral nation from its very founding. Now, I don't know about the accuracy of the last name origin point that Miss Reid was trying to make. I mean, it seems very logical that these names had to come from somewhere, although I'm not sure if that really matters. I mean, everybody's last name had to come from somewhere. It's not something that most rational people think very much about. I'll continue with her post, and I quote again. I mean, ask yourself, how many white Washingtons, Monroes, Jeffersons, and Jacksons do you know? Pretty much everyone I've known with those last names throughout my life has been Black. And it so happens that our founders were among the most prolific slaveholders of their time. Coincidence? I don't know. Maybe I'll check in with the 1619 Project while it's still legal to read in the People's Republic of Trump America. End quote. Joy Reid's point, reminds me, I think, of a rap song I may have heard as a child of many people, of many Black individuals today being named after presidents and so forth. It's something I haven't thought about, I guess, since then. So I actually, replied to her post as I very often do, and this is what I said. Joy, isn't your family from Guyana and the Congo? Why are you even talking about this? Your ancestors probably sold slaves into captivity, end quote. And I said this to make the very obvious point that Joy's parents are actually not American and her roots are from elsewhere. This is no different than the case for Barack Obama or Kamala Harris as well. Barack Obama's father is from Kenya, and Kamala Harris, her parents are from Jamaica and India. They're also not Native African Americans, and they didn't suffer in any way from the legacy of American slavery. Um, so Joy actually, responded to me after a few minutes. Joy, and I quote, "Guyana was a British slave colony. My ancestors there were slaves from Ghana. And if my family in Congo sold people to white Europeans, I want to know about it. It's history. It has force only to allow us to improve. I wouldn't hide from it like the cowards on the American right," end quote. She continued by saying to me, quote, "Also, you seem awfully knowledgeable about me for someone who pretends to despise me. Are you a stan or a bot?" End quote, with a screenshot of my profile. I don't despise you, Joy. I actually find you quite amusing, and quite dangerous as well, I will say. Now, it's silly to think, for Joy to think that I'm a bot, and I could have come up with such a specific and clever response to her post so quickly. I don't think Joy Reid really knows how bots work. As far as being a stan, I confess I didn't know what a stan was until she suggested that I may be a stan, and I looked it up, and a stan is apparently someone who is a cult-like fan of a specific media personality. Now, I think that Joy Reid may be overselling herself just a little bit, As someone with a TV show, she has an ego, I'm sure. But I do follow her to, for the sole purpose of attacking her divisive and anti-American and evil, I think, opinions. I feel like this is my patriotic duty. And I think Joy may actually be shocked to learn that many others follow her for the very same reason, not because they agree with her views. Now it's interesting, typically somebody with 2 million followers doesn't bother attacking or responding to somebody with about 100 followers on Twitter like myself, especially given my moniker between the ears rather than my actual name. But last night, perhaps after one too many Merlots, Joy felt compelled to swing back. And my reaction was, good for her and great. I mean, we can have a discussion. Very interestingly, back to the free speech point, immediately after her remark, I was notified by Twitter of a 12-hour ban for another reply to one of Miss Reid's posts where I called her, and I quote, a race baiting retard, end quote. I apparently, violated Twitter's policy on hateful conduct, particularly incitement against protected categories. Now, here's what I'll say to that. Race baiting is a very sober and rational description of what Joy Reid does every night on television. She makes every single issue about race to divide the country. And I would just have to ask, in what world is calling her presentation race baiting hateful or racially provocative? This is what anybody, I think, right of center politically would say that she does. And in terms of calling her a retard, I'll admit this was in poor taste given the politically correct guidelines in place today. When I was growing up, only 20 years ago, the word retard just meant idiot or fool. It's very difficult to keep up with language restrictions that are constantly changing. But it wasn't intended, of course, to attack people that are actually mentally ill. So I asked Twitter what their specific reasoning was for the 12-hour ban, and I've yet to hear back. But my account is back up and running since the 12-hour ban has elapsed. Now, I have every reason to think that Homer Simpson, I mean Joy Reid, excuse me, was actually behind Twitter's ban as a blue check with 2 million followers and a substantial platform. Along with, of course, being both black and a woman, having the double victim card, she can easily influence her leftist allies on Twitter to suspend my account for a non-reason. And her lame reply to my message on Twitter just illustrated to me the classic leftist principle of having a one-way dialogue. There was no interest in an actual discussion or debate, which they would, of course, lose. If you ever want an example of this from Joy Reid's history, look at her interview with Christopher Rufo on YouTube, and you'll see what I mean. And we'll cover the merits behind her slavery last name remarks perhaps another time. But, her attitude here was no different than other leftists throughout history. Joe Stalin, Kim Jong-un, Hitler, Mao, other famous leftists were also not interested in any kind of a dialogue or a free speech, but rather wished to impose their vision on the population. The point being that this is censorship firsthand. And, if someone like myself or my anonymous Twitter account with about 100 followers can get suspended for basically nothing, what lengths, I would ask, would the left go to silence somebody with actual power and influence? And we can see the answer to that rhetorical question with what they've done with President Trump. I'll conclude by saying we do not have free speech in this country until both sides can speak freely. It's very axiomatic in that way. I mean, even in Nazi Germany, Hitler and Joseph Goebbels and those in power had their own version of free speech, and they could say whatever they wanted, but their opposition could not. And I fear that this is, quickly where we're headed in America. This is the most important issue today in this country, and this is why all conservative patriots must be fervently behind Donald Trump's lawsuit to punish big tech for their censorship. This is Yosemite Sam, and you just got an earful.